our friend today, but that's okay. We'll have a good time with that. Welcome back. My name is Mary Ann, and on behalf of the entire World Affairs Council, we're so honored and pleased that you could join us today for our program. We are delighted that we have Representative Dan Crenshaw with us, and I know we are going to have a dynamic conversation on global security and all kinds of fun national security information. So, raise your hand if it's your first time at a council event. First time? Well, welcome. We're so honored to have you. We are Houston's premier organization for global education, and we welcome you to any one of our programs. This is our final program for 2021, and we are so excited. We have some amazing programs for you in 2022. The first one being in January with Afghan Brigadier General and Deputy Interior Minister for Security, Michelle Sadat. So you can check out all of our programs. We not only do programs like this at luncheons, but we do events in the evening. We have programs in Katy, sometimes Sugarland up in the Woodlands, and we'd love to have you out. We also travel the world and understand what's happening when we go visit Saudi Arabia or Egypt or Moldova, wherever we're going. So we have about 10 trips planned in 2022. Small group, wonderfully catered environment that you have an opportunity to travel with the World Affairs Council. So make sure you visit our website again, wachhouston.org. I want to remind everybody that we do have question cards, and I think the representative is on a bit of a time schedule. So if you have questions, I invite you to fill them out quickly and give them to one of our colleagues. We'll try to weave them into the conversation as best we can. Now it's my honor and privilege to introduce our speaker today, joining our programs director, Ronan O'Malley. Representative Dan Crenshaw, many of you know him, decorated Navy SEAL, and we're so pleased that he could be here with us today. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming.
Thank you, Congressman. I like this. The SEAL and you, most speakers take the stairs. You just jumped onto the stage. So I would say thank you all very much for coming. This is a wonderful way to end an interesting year or two, really, for all of us. We've been trying to work out event with the Congressman for it seems like 2+ years. So I'm so glad we're finally able to do it. And for those of you who might know, Congress went a little bit late, so Congressman just arrived back in last night and did one event this morning, and he has another one right after this. So I will ask, when we finish, if you please remain seated so that he can get out and get to his next appointment as quickly as possible. Congressman, thank you again so much for your service and for continuing to serve. You know, I think Congress, when it's done by the right way, by the right people, both on the left and the right, it is truly a service. Like most of the people in Congress are doing their best to serve the country. They might have different ways of approaching it. But I think a lot of Americans are perhaps understandably, concerned about the degree of intense partisanship in Congress now, and maybe looking for hope. And I suppose maybe for me, if I see any area of hope, it might be that while the relative number of veterans in Congress is relatively low right now, it's only about 1 in 6. What's perhaps promising is for congressmen and women like yourself who are under age 45, that number is 1 in 3. With most of them, a lot of them having served in Iraq or Afghanistan, a lot of them like yourself with combat experience. Do you think we can maybe take hope from the fact that if there are a good number of professionals with military backgrounds that are both Democrats and Republicans? They're people who are used to working together for a common cause in the military. They're used to doing their job professionally, whether it's a Democrat that's president or Republican that's president. Do you think hopefully that's maybe an area to kind of look for hope or a way that maybe Congress can start to weave itself back together?
Yeah, a little bit. And thanks for having me. There are more and more veterans running, and that is a net benefit. It doesn't mean we're going to vote together, and I don't want to give any false expectations on that. But veterans in Congress do tend to just have a more moderated tone. Again, doesn't mean we're going to vote together. The point of going to Congress is not to go for consensus just for the sake of consensus. You should be terrified of consensus. That's also the same thing as authoritarianism, is when there's just a consensus on how things should be. The entire point of politics and the entire point of the way our federal system is set up is to have that division, right? And that division is meant to play out in the public sphere as opposed to war. That's how our republic was created. And so we should always take a step back and say, like, this isn't exactly wrong that things are stuck in the mud, that we can't get anything done, because what does anything done mean? What is good? What is the good stuff that you want done? You disagree. You disagree within this room, you disagree with your neighbors, and we disagree from state to state, and representatives disagree. It's called politics. So, I'm not sure that we should take this pessimistic view of the gridlock in Washington all the time. Now the tone is a different story, and I think that's what you mean. And that's the good news about veterans. And one thing I like about veterans in Congress, and I think this is largely true, is they tend to want to be right. And so, and I know that may sound like a funny thing to say, but I think a lot of members of Congress actually don't care if they're right. Right? So what they care about is the reaction that they're going to get and what kind of emotional reaction that will garner for them, that maybe results in better fundraising or a cheer from the crowd or whatever it is. They want to own the libs or own the cons, whatever it is. That's not exact. Their priority is not being correct. Veterans tend to want to be correct, if for no more reason than a matter of pride and professionalism. And so I think on both sides, that can be quite helpful, to be honest. Doesn't mean we're going to vote together. Doesn't mean we're going to get the stuff done necessarily. But again, you shouldn't really want that exactly, because that just means one party rule. And we should like disagreement, but that disagreement should be wholesome. And it should be civil. But we should celebrate disagreement. It's the nature of our system, and it will always be there. So get used to it. There is a predisposition to liberalism and conservatism. People are wired differently, and it's almost a perfect 50-50 mix. And of course, there's a spectrum in between. But I also think that's consistent across human history and across all countries. We call it different things. In the United States, we call it Democrats and Republicans. In the UK, it's Labor and Conservatives. But the dispositions are very similar. And there are fundamental disagreements on the things that government can accomplish for you. It's a fundamental disagreement, which is why it's hard to get things done. Because there are fundamental philosophical differences in how we should govern and what the role of government even is. It doesn't keep me up at night. Right, that there's gridlock. What keeps me up at night are the grifters who try to lie in order to gain attention. That's the toxic part. But usually that happens within each side, right? There's factions within the left that do that to themselves, and there's factions within the right that do that to themselves. It just frustrates everybody else who is just looking for some truth.
And again, relating to the role of Congress, if the Founding Fathers saw the power and authority of an American president has now, they'd probably be astounded. The executive office, executive authority of the country is much bigger, much more powerful, much more dynamic than they might have ever imagined. Since World War II, we haven't officially declared war. We've obviously had other ways of doing it through Congress, but we've been engaged militarily at dozens of places all around the world, from lower level conflicts to obviously intense wars and long wars like Iraq and Afghanistan, both where you served. Do you think at some stage, even whether it's a Democrat or Republican, obviously it's their right as commander-in-chief, they are the head of the U.S. military, but that Congress perhaps isn't approached or broached quickly enough with regards to when and how we use military force? I mean, sometimes there's not time for that. If a terrorist attack happens or something, you have to respond. But overall, do you think Congress is involved enough in the decision of when and how we go to war?
Well, it depends on which war, I suppose. Congress voted for the 2001 and 2003 AUMFs, voted for it, and never voted to rescind them until recently. And that is Congress's inaction is assertion. It is an action in and of itself. The refusal to act is in and of itself an action. So, you know, but the people who say that Congress is not asserting its authority are the ones who think that we should vote to rescind that authority. So, you know, it's just a manner of speaking, really. But the end result is the same. But at any moment, Congress can and does have the authority to vote for a different policy, should we want that and need that. But the general answer to your question is I would say, yes, Congress has probably not done so, right? Not asserted any sort of opinion or guidance to the executive on a whole variety of issues. And because Congress is not a nimble body, it was never meant to be a nimble body. The Constitution is actually pretty clear on the president's authority on foreign policy. So I'm not sure this is a big departure from the Constitution either, because you do want a single executive to have a little bit more authority and leeway to act within foreign policy. What the Constitution says is that war powers must be derived from Congress, and then you have to define war. And see, that's where all the gray area happens, because what is war? You know, we generally define war as a state-on-state action, but in the modern world, it's not exactly that clear. You know, our state, our allies, the Afghan government, we're fighting their insurgency, or our allies, the Iraqi government. So it's not a state-on-state battle. And so there's just a lot of gray area there. And it's going to continue to be a gray zone with respect to policy and debate, and it should be. We should continue to debate these things. And I'd be, you know, look, we've had these debates for a while on whether to say rescind an AUMF, 2001 AUMF for Afghanistan or 2003 AUMF with Iraq. In my opinion, has always been they should be updated but not rescinded. And then the debate ends right there, and then we just end up doing nothing. So it's not like these discussions aren't happening, but there's just disagreement. There's simple disagreement, and so the status quo remains. And that can be a bad thing or a good thing, but it depends on what side of the debate you're on.
And, you know, after, you know, almost 20 years of war, first in Afghanistan, obviously Iraq, there's, from both the left and the right, there's a sizable number of the American population that feels kind of war weary, and perhaps maybe what's at least concerning, I would say, at least concerning to me, or what we try to discuss in the World Affairs Council, that there's a growing number of Americans who feel the United States should perhaps step back from the world, that we shouldn't be so engaged, that maybe the military is not as important as it needs to be, maybe we don't need to pursue as much diplomatically. Are you concerned yourself about Americans kind of feeling, we've done it before, World War I, World War II, with bad repercussions, that a lot of Americans are looking for the United States to step back? We've got Russia and China are very happy to step in. What's your concern?
Yeah, it's definitely a concern. There's certainly there's always been an isolationist streak in the American population. It is nothing new. And I wonder if it largely comes from fear of the unknown. I mean, the loudest voices who scream "No more endless wars" and "Bring the troops home" are usually bow tie wearing guys that have never served overseas and shed any blood. Let's just be honest. Too afraid to, and they're frankly happy that somebody else is willing to do it for them. And it's fear of the unknown. They fear what they don't know, and I think maybe a little bit of it is they have a chip on their shoulder because they didn't do it themselves. I think that's true. But that isolationist streak has also come from a lack of leadership over the last 20 years, because we failed to tell the American people what the heck we were really doing in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. And Iraq's a tougher one, because with hindsight being 2020, it's hard to argue that was worth our time. Afghanistan's a different story, but then we failed to tell people why we continued to be in Afghanistan, and that we were really there more of it as an insurance policy against future 9/11 attacks. And that lack of explanation and leadership over time led to that war weariness, led to the sloganeering that led to the disastrous withdrawal just a few months ago. By sloganeering, I mean we basically made foreign policy based on slogans. No more endless wars, bring the troops home. Like, that was our foreign policy. It was nonsense. And it just it removed all the complexities of a very complex situation and boiled it and reduced it to these foolish slogans. And we had the result that we did. So it's certainly concerning. I think, if you look at the left of the political spectrum, they're probably largely more wary. About half the right is as well. It's unclear what they would support. You can always find a reason to say no, and it's unclear that they'd be willing to stand up if we needed to. It's unclear what that even looks like, right? It's hard to predict what the future holds. There does seem to be widespread agreement that we need to be prepared for all circumstances and give our military the resources it needs. So that's the good news, I think.
And touching on Afghanistan, where obviously you served at Iraq as well. I think even President Biden, most of his national security team would at least privately admit that you mentioned the withdrawal over the summer was disastrous. But in the bigger, like you mentioned, sense of leadership for American presidents, from Bush to Obama to Trump to now Biden, in some ways Biden would argue, well, I'm following the policies started by President Obama. I'm adhering to an agreement President Trump reached with the Taliban, or I'm just carrying out what's the will of the American people who feel like, what are we still doing in Afghanistan? Obviously, I don't want to replay what's happened in the withdrawal, but where do you see the U.S. or how do you see we might have to be involved with Afghanistan going forward? Do you think we have to have an unusual scenario where because of the threat of ISIS-K in Afghanistan, we might actually have to collaborate some more with the Taliban to take on more extreme terrorist elements? Or do you think we eventually get to a stage where we're supporting maybe insurgency groups like Massoud's son, who was holed up in Panjshir Valley, fighting for a few weeks after the news pulled out? Where do you see the U.S. in the next few years regarding Afghanistan, and what would you like us to do?
I don't know. I don't see us doing much of anything. I don't see this administration doing much of anything. I've gotten no indication that they're taking any action one way or the other on any of those options that you laid out. And it's unclear whether they should or shouldn't, to be honest. I'd have to do a much deeper dive to really make an honest assessment of that. We should have stayed. That's what we should have done, and kept our own presence there, because anything we do from here on out it's just very unclear what the outcome will be. And it'll depend on intelligence that we hopefully get, but we can't really get because we left. So it's there's not really any good options at this point. You're going to continue to hear bad stories coming from Afghanistan, whether those are human rights abuses or intelligence that suggests that Al Qaeda and ISIS-K are able to conduct external operations and sooner than we thought. I think you're just going to continue to hear that. And if we can do something about it, if there's an obvious target that we can strike, maybe we strike it. But it's hard to find that obvious target because we don't have any capabilities there anymore. This over-the-horizon nonsense you hear about, it's just that, it's nonsense. There is no capability like that from a special operations standpoint. I mean, they should be challenged more on what they mean by that. You just don't know what's happening. You don't have people on the ground running source networks. You don't have constant ISR overhead. We have very little knowledge of what's going on. But as far as Biden's excuses for leaving, I mean, I guess all of those things are correct, but in the end, Trump didn't leave. In 4 years to screw it up, he didn't screw it up. Biden was in charge and easily could have changed things if he had desired to. And if he had just listened to what the military was telling him and what his aides were telling him, which is they told him the same thing they told President Trump. President Trump wanted to leave, every day, wake up and say, I want to get everybody out. And everybody would be like, well, this will happen if you do that. And he's like, fine. And stop. So, he listened to his aides, and I think their compromise internally was like, well, fine, but we're going to do a deal with the Taliban. And I was critical of that deal. It was a silly deal, but at least it had conditions on it, and those conditions were broken, and Biden still went through with it. So the Trump administration would argue, the current, when they'll come talk at events like this, like Mike Pompeo, like Mike Pence, they'll say, well, we had conditions in place. We were not going to do it this way because we had a deal that certainly required the Taliban, for instance, to cut ties with Al Qaeda, and they were never going to do that. So that's what they would say. What would have happened? I don't know, because it didn't happen, and what did happen did happen. So it's one person's fault.
And again, I know your focus in Congress is not foreign policy. It's a lot of variety. So I'm not expecting specifics or exact details, but obviously a region you're very familiar with, and at a personal level, you note in your book that much of the IEDs that caused a large percentage of the injuries and deaths of American men and women serving there, the IEDs were either built or had trainers and expertise in perhaps bomb-making materials that came from Iran, which is not surprising, but also in Pakistan. You talk to anyone in the military served in Afghanistan. Pakistan was always an incredible frustration at best, at worst, kind of a complicit ally who was supporting the Taliban. What do you think the U.S. should do in regards to Pakistan? It's in a vital, geopolitically important location, so we can't ignore them, cut them out completely, especially if China gets tighter with them. What do you think we should do? Or should we just tighten our relationships with India? How do we approach it?
Or we should do both. I mean, like we have to get away from this weird, naive foreign policy notion, which is often present in your master's degrees programs and in all the big elite schools of well, they have to meet these conditions of humanitarian, whatever, and then we can be friends. It's like, no, you just got to be friends with bad people. You have to live in the real world, and we have. I remember when we did a congressional trip to Israel a few years ago, and this was right when the Saudis had chopped up that reporter Khashoggi. That was pretty bad. But it was funny because the Democrats in our delegation were so mad about it. They were so mad about it. They were very emotional about this. And I'm just not very emotional about it. We've worked in the Middle East. It's bad. We condemn it, but then we move on. You have to. I mean, we can pretend like the world is a different place than we want it to be, but that's pretending. We should write fiction novels about that if we desire. And then these Israelis were always really funny about this, and they're not exactly friends of the Saudis, but they would look at us like, "You guys need to get over this. This is the Middle East, and move past it." And that's the same kind of holds for Pakistan. You have to keep trying to commit to the relationship, but just do it with both eyes open. I think that's the right way to look at all of these different countries. Think through relationships with leverage in mind, with incentives in mind, and what doesn't work is what I think. And I can't tell what this administration's doctrine is. I really can't tell. It's not clear. But appeasement does not work. Like trying to be nice and giving things away with the hopes that that'll elicit some kind of nice change. It just doesn't work with these types of people, these types of countries. So it should stop. It's not going to work with Iran. If we're foolish enough to get back into the Iran nuclear deal, it is just not what they respond to. And they take advantage of it, sure. So I guess they respond in some way, but they're not going to respond the way we want them.
You mentioned Iran. We unilaterally withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA. There are other people, generals or high-level people in intelligence would say, look, I know it wasn't a great deal, but given the choice between having some form of agreement that puts restrictions on Iran's nuclear weapons, obviously a rogue, dangerous state, and having no idea of what's going on and no restrictions on the nuclear program, I choose the first, even for the core option. So would you be willing to enter another nuclear deal with Iran, especially if the one big caveat that probably will never get addressed is Iran will probably refuse to give up its military actions in the region in Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. Would you consider another nuclear deal, and if so, what would you require?
Well, no, because the second part of that isn't true, right? Like the if that you stated, which was if you knew that what was the choices? Basically, if you let them do what they want, or if you at least restrict them from building something, and at least you know what they're building, but you don't know what they're building. So that's a false premise. And we did not have access to their military sites. We didn't have access to a lot of different things that would have been required for us to actually have that knowledge that the premise of this deal relies upon. The other problem with it is that there's always going to be a sunset. And as long as there's a sunset to the deal, then all it is basically giving them the ability to continue to enrich and to continue to advance their centrifuge capacity and advance their centrifuge technology to the point where when the sunset does happen, they're ready to go right away. This is why the Israelis are so against this, why everybody in the Middle East who actually has to be there is so against it. But again, our bright-eyed and bushy-tailed foreign policy naivete got the best of us and entered into that foolish deal. And when we got out of it, what happened? We got our leverage back. And these people only understand strength and leverage, and that's the only way that we should deal with them. There is, and we have to stop pretending that there's any reasonable pursuit in a place like Iran for nuclear energy. That's nonsense. I'm always trying to get more nuclear energy in the United States, and it's hard because it's too expensive. So don't tell me that the oil-rich country of Iran needs nuclear energy for their energy needs. That's a bunch of BS. Like, I just don't know why we don't just stop that right then and there. So it's just none of it's true, and there shouldn't be another deal. We should be supporting our Israeli friends on this one.
And just in looking at the region as a whole, the United States has been really since Truman and Eisenhower and even World War II before that, FDR, an ever-increasing role and I suppose presence in the Middle East. In a lot of ways, in reality, in ways that have not benefited the United States. Maybe it's helped our allies in the region, but on the whole, I think most Americans would say we've got the short end of the stick. Even if you may not agree with the exact terms of the policy or whatever, do you agree with the overall premise of the idea of a pivot to Asia, the idea of pivoting our geopolitical focus, our military focus on China as opposed to the Middle East?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Economically speaking, militarily speaking, and everybody's doing this. The military is certainly only thinking in these terms at this point. Special Operations Command is really thinking about their future in these terms as well. I'm not even sure we're still teams are deploying right now. Everything's in flux because we're just not doing those missions like we used to. And so part of how special operations is involved in the Pacific is mostly through partner alliances, which has been ongoing for years. This isn't anything new, but that's a big part of it. It shouldn't be U.S. versus China. It should be everyone versus China. That's how we have to think about this and build capacity with our alliances. So pivot to Asia is extremely important, and making sure that we're investing in the right weapons systems and maintaining some flexibility in how to react to future threats. Because what the Chinese are good at is just all they have to do is figure out what our one weakness is. So they're like, oh, okay, this is their capability on an air-to-air missile, so we're going to build one that can do just a little bit better. And then they really screw with us that way. Whereas we always have to be the world power that thinks of everything. So we're at a disadvantage in that sense, which is why we have to invest so much more. But it's exciting to see some of the thinking that's going on in the Pentagon. And I think it's the right direction. Plus, shouldn't get into a lot of details on that, but I think it's the right direction that focuses on, look, if we're going to have a conflict in this region, how survivable are our forces? Is the way we think about aircraft carrier groups the right way to think about it? Because we can't really stop a missile from maybe we can stop one missile, but then they just shoot 10 more. What are we going to do with Guam and our forces in Japan? How are we spreading these forces out to make them more survivable? What's the right weapon systems to be investing in, like submarines, for instance? Definitely a change and a paradigm shift, and certainly a healthy one that does seem to have momentum for sure.
Just two more questions. I'm going to turn it over to the audience and has a lot of great questions. You mentioned special forces. The last 20 years especially, probably there's never been a time in American history where they've been so burdened and so in some ways probably overworked and over-dependent upon. I mean, some of that's because we're fighting an insurgency, an enemy where there are no front lines, where they mix in with the public. But also some of that's because American presidents haven't been willing to put larger forces in place in Iraq, in Afghanistan. Do you think we've expected too much of special forces, and maybe it's you guys have done incredible work, but at the end of the day, if you don't have enough just regular soldiers on the ground, you don't establish a presence, you don't make relations with the community. Do you think we've become too dependent upon it, whether it be the SEALs or Delta Force or CIA teams?
I don't know. That's a neat ask. It's not as if a SEAL platoon gets to, there's very strict rules under what's called your deployment ratios. So, it requires waivers if you want to, like these guys, some especially single guys, will be like, no, I want to go back out the door. So they'll have to get waivers to even be able to deploy again. So I don't want anybody to be under the impression that it's just these back-to-back deployments. Now it depends. Some guys have gone through that, some units have, but it's something that the force has been aware of for quite a long time and sought to diminish. The frustration from the special operations community comes from a lack of war. Combat, if you're being honest. They get really mad when they have to go deploy to Guam and just do exercises for 6 months. I mean, really, that's how it is. So it's not quite what people think. So if you look at the Marine Corps is really transforming their force. I always like the Marine Corps because they're a very nimble force and they take action when they have ideas, and they're transitioning to a much different force structure that is a lot more smaller units. They're getting rid of tanks, for instance, so that they can invest in different kinds of weapon systems that make sense for the Pacific especially. So again, there's a lot of transitions happening that I think make our traditional forces look a little bit more like special operations forces. Same is happening in the Navy with some ideas on what kind of ships and what kind of footprint to have. Smaller locations, more dispersed, therefore more survivable. I think that's the future in the Pacific.
Maybe it's the last question kind of related to your book. Many of you might already have it, and if not, I recommend it. Your book's excellent, and I read a lot of great books. A lot of wonderful American leaders come in like yourself, but this was quite different. A really unique perspective. Less about just the specifics of foreign policy.
You might want to mention for Christmas, if you go to dancrenshaw.com, you can get a signed one or even a personalized one at dancrenshaw.com. Best Christmas gift that you can imagine. My staff's like, you're not allowed to.
In the book, and obviously people might have seen, during your time in Congress and more recently, a few headlines here and there. I think a lot of people appreciate the fact that you're willing and ready to be a reasonable voice to kind of call out the extreme left in Congress and beyond Congress, who are kind of always looking at an idea of victimization and kind of the extremes. Extreme right. Sadly, we have with parts of the right who no longer believe in any of American institutions, or very little belief in American institutions, and some of them even kind of collapsing into conspiracy theories. What do you think you and maybe your fellow members of men and women in Congress can do to kind of bring back the reasonable center? I mean, the World Affairs Council, I think, I'll say myself personally, I think the United States is best served when we have a strong and capable Democratic Party and a strong and capable Republican Party. And over time, it'll balance out, but we need reasonable people, good people. Like you're saying, you hold your beliefs, but you're willing to work with each other. What can be done to address that?
Yeah, it's a tough one. We were talking about that just before I came up. What's interesting about that fringe left and right that you talked about, you said victimhood, but there's actually both sides are, I think you can boil it down to this sense of victimhood, and it's very toxic. It's a toxic trend in American culture, this sort of this feeling that everybody's against me, that I have no control over my life, that somebody else controls my destiny, and that's pervasive on the left and it's pervasive in the right in different ways, but it's pervasive nonetheless. The right, you talk about conspiracy theories. Fundamentally, that's still about a lack of control. That somebody else is pulling the strings that you don't have control over. Somebody else is doing something to you. So that's how they think about it on the right. And look, the more moderate right-wingers like myself, we're always suspicious. We're always suspicious of big government programs, things like that. But of course, as that gets more extreme, it turns into conspiratorial thinking. On the left, that victimhood results in more of a strive for power, right? Because they feel victimized, or they want to be champions of the victims, and therefore need more power to do nice things. And so this is how it manifests, I think. It will always be that way. How do you get more moderate? Well, we'll talk about political sciences discussion. Something called the intensity of preferences. And the intensity of preferences refers to this idea that, look, the middle's not very intense. If you're very moderate, if you're a moderate thinker, if you're the type of person to say, look, on the one hand this, and on the other hand this, are you really likely to go picket somewhere? Are you likely to go, like, have a sign up at your next town hall? No, you're not. It's just not who you are. But if you're not that way, if you're more, I've got my beliefs and I'm sticking to them, I will never, you are more likely to be more intense and make your opinions known to your representatives. You're more likely to comment online. You're more likely to just be loud. And so all of the noise comes from the people who are very dead set in their ways on either the fringe left or the fringe right. So Washington is really just, and politics in general is just a manifestation of that reality of the general public. And so it's not as easy as just having better leaders. I mean, it's certainly a part of it, because as a leader, you can do one of two things. Simply represent the emotion, which is kind of populism in my estimation. I mean, some people have a nice view of populism, some people don't. It kind of depends on how you define it. I define it as simply reflecting the emotions of the people, which isn't a good thing, because that's not leadership. That's just being a robot. What are you feeling? Or you're angry? I'm angry too. And then you trust me, right? It's a way to trick you into trusting me, just by reflecting the emotions that you're expressing. So that's not leadership, though. Leadership is telling hard truths, disagreeing, like trying to bring people to what is actually correct. And we can still disagree ultimately on what's correct, but a lot of things are not necessarily, well, we disagree. No, some things are just facts and not facts. And we have to at least agree on that, but we don't. And so I think it's my point is it's both, right? It's a cultural problem where people are quick to jump to conclusions and quick to be very emotional about things, and that manifests in our politics ultimately. And it's hard to fix. That's why I wrote a book about not being emotional. DanCrenshaw.com. That's a great Christmas gift. So I mean, I'm not giving you an exact solution except read the book, and then it'll fix our politics if everybody kind of I think took that to heart, because look, the silent majority is silent. It will always be silent. And it's hard, I'll say this last thing, just again, kind of political science lesson. It's hard for politicians to cater to and pander to the middle, because for a few reasons. One, in many ways, the middle is a knife edge, so you can't stand on it without getting cut. And in other ways, the middle is it's too diverse. A table full of people here might view themselves as moderates, kind of centrists in the middle, but what's important to you, if I asked you what issues matter to you, you probably all have different answers. So there's not a way for me as a politician to grab that electorate and use it as a base that I can rely on to get reelected. This is an important political science truth, which is why politicians have to, the first rule you have is don't piss off your base, okay? And it's just, it's hard to see a way out of that. People are like, well, what about a third party? It wouldn't work. It wouldn't work for the exact reason that I just stated, because, and by the way, other countries don't really have third parties. Like parliamentary systems, they don't really have third parties. They just have coalitions that still fall in the same spectrum that we have. So it's hard to do because we're dispositionally wired to have this sort of liberal conservative bent. And there will always be that dichotomy. And again, we said this earlier, the key to health in the country is a matter of tone and civil disagreement as opposed to the sort of lies and slandering that our politics has become, where politics becomes, well, you got a really bad person on your side, that's why you guys are all bad. Well, you got a worse person on your side. Look at that one, look what they did. And it's like, what are you even arguing about? It's not healthcare policy. It's just who's a worse person. I think that's what people are really sick of, is that silly kind of tit for tat.
And I would say by far it was the most common question. I think I have 6 or 7 questions that were all on that track, all asking.
Glad I spent some time on it.
Yeah, asking about how do we kind of get back to more reasonable politics? How do we get about that?
Well, and maybe the last thing I'll say is get involved in primaries, because that's where these battles actually happen on the left and the right, is primary elections. That's why I'm supporting Morgan Luttrell. He's got a really competitive primary. This is where Kevin Brady is retiring from in Texas 8. I'm supporting Morgan Luttrell because this is the kind of person you want. Somebody who wants to be right and correct. It's very easy to tell your voters exactly what they want to hear, even if it's incorrect. It's very easy. You can always be popular doing that, especially in a deep red or a deep blue district. But it's a little bit harder to try and be an honest leader. And so you got to get involved in primaries. If you're a Democrat in the room and you want more moderate Democrats, you got to vote in primaries. You got to work in primaries. It's really, really important. Same with Republicans.
An ongoing question and more of concern as technology gets deeper and deeper. Someone asked, what's the right balance of security and the cost of privacy?
So the right balance of
I suppose between national security issues and privacy. Obviously you have things like the NSA disclosures, what happened there, how much does the United States government need to know with regards to what private individuals are doing? I mean, it's a hard balance.
Yeah, it is, but they don't need to know much. This is the right answer for when it comes to U.S. citizens. Now, there's also a bit of a misunderstanding about what they do know. Right? Edward Snowden was a liar. Okay, anyways. For the sake of aggrandizing his own role, he misled a lot of people on what NSA capabilities really are. And I know because I've worked on these systems quite a bit in targeting and whatnot. And look, if you're doing source operations or you're doing SIGINT analysis, you're not allowed to target U.S. citizens. It requires, people who are supposed to do that require a court order. It has to be the FBI, it has to be domestic law enforcement. There's a very big separation there. So that's the first thing, is that it was overstated, and it's been overstated for quite a while. They're not reading your emails, they don't have your records, they just don't, and nor should they. And if there's abuses of that, Congress needs to root that out. So look, I'm always gonna err on the side of privacy over security. Look, I'm like this close to calling for TSA to be disbanded. Okay, I am just so sick of going. I'm just so sick of it. I'm just this close. I didn't say I was quite there, Justin. I said I'm close. I travel a lot, and I'm like, why? Why does this mom with 3 kids need to have her baby formula on? Come on, leave her alone. This is can we have some more reasonable screening processes? The simple answer is err on the side of privacy over security.
And a good question, obviously, for you, it's personal, for any of the veterans in the room who served there. Someone asked, with all the military equipment left behind in Afghanistan, are you concerned that another 9/11 could happen?
Well, yeah, which is my whole reason for never wanting to leave, because all the critics would say, well, what do we get from 20 years of war? And they think they're asking a really good, insightful question, but they're not, because the answer is actually really simple. No more 9/11s. That's what we got, and that's actually a pretty big deal. And how quickly America forgot why we were there. We weren't at war on September 10th, 2001. They were at war with us, and they're still at war with us. Now they just have pallets of cash and weapons and resources and all the time and 20 years of experience, too, figuring out what our weaknesses are. Right now, our biggest weakness appears to be the border. Right? It's not our planes. Our planes are locked up at this point. I don't think that's not going to be their next target. But there's so many ways to hit a free society. There's so many ways if you just have a mild amount of creativity and access, and they can easily gain access to the southern border right now. It's an absolute atrocity what's happening down
there. 2 or 3 questions related to China. Again, it's kind of broad strokes because it involves military, economic, however you want to address it. Is there currently enthusiasm in the government for increasing U.S. exports to China, such as natural resources? If not, what can we do to promote that order in order to balance our trade deficit with them? And another question, are we doing enough militarily to prepare for China's growing might?
So, trade deficits never bother me, right? Like you have a trade deficit with your grocery store. You're giving them money and they're giving you a good. You have a trade deficit. So what? The trade deficit isn't what bothers me. I do want them to buy more, say, of our natural gas. That's what I focus on in energy and commerce. Is how is our energy sector going to survive this administration? And I say this to the climate activists: if you really want to have an impact on reducing carbon emissions, the thing that you should fight for the most is a trade deal with China where they buy more of our natural gas, because that's going to displace their coal. And they burn more coal than anybody in the world. They're responsible for 30% of emissions globally. We're responsible for 11%. They put 3 times more coal online capacity last year than the rest of the world combined. So they need more of our natural gas, because they're not going to do the solar and wind thing. They do it every once in a while to kind of appease the climate activists, but they're full of it. And also, it's not going to meet their energy needs. The irony of solar and wind is you cannot build solar and wind with solar and wind because it doesn't produce heat, and therefore steel. So more natural gas exports would be my #1 priority to China and India. As far as other exports, I mean, it kind of gets to another question of what is the government's role in that, and is it even helpful to have a heavy hand over how trade really happens between 2 countries? I think the conversation should be on those bigger ticket items like accepting more of our natural gas.
All right. And actually, surprised, I had 2 or 3 questions related to Latin America. For those that always don't know, you spent a year in Ecuador as growing up in high school in Bogota, in Colombia. So you have much more familiarity with Latin America than the vast majority of Congress. Someone asked, is American leadership in the hemisphere lacking? Should we be doing more?
Yeah, that's a good question, and the answer is yes. We're trying to plan a trip right now to Mexico and Colombia, and I think we do need a pivot to both South America and the Pacific. The pivot to South America is probably more economic in nature. We have an interest, and political in nature too. Colombia has an election coming up where you've got a Chavista type candidate running that is very popular right now and could destroy all of the progress Colombia has made in the last 20 years. South America is always teetering. I mean, I would love to see more involvement in Mexico too. And they're right in our backyard, and I just feel like overall this is a forgotten part of our foreign policy that should require a lot more attention. I met with the Colombian ambassador a few weeks ago. They're begging Biden to come down to Colombia, and because of this election coming up, he's not very popular here, but he's very popular in Colombia for some reason. and so they're like, just have him come down to help support our government and show that we have a relationship with America. Yeah, this is massively important. So I hope he does it. I know they're talking about it.
And then just 2 more questions for the sake of time. A lot of great audience questions. We got to most of them. Something I think it's what you represent. I think a lot of people look forward, hopefully, to you, and part of the reason why people feel confidence with you. Someone asked, as a moderate who used to predominantly vote GOP, I yearn for a return to a reasonable, principled, thoughtful Republican Party. What I suppose is really on that, where is it going? Where did you see it going? Is is the party represented by Trump now, or is there the traditional Bush-Baker, kind of core of the Republican Party still there?
It's a matter of tone, right? It's a difference in tone, because I'm not so sure how Trump governs differently than a Bush-Baker would have governed. If you just take away all the tweets and the rhetoric, and you just look at the actions, I'm not sure what the difference is. I think the biggest difference is Trump was more skeptical of China and trade and free trade than everybody else was. But frankly, let's be honest, that's a healthy skepticism that frankly I think should have infiltrated the Republican Party. I'm not sure what other massive changes there have been. I mean, the beauty of conservatism is it keeps you in a box. That's the whole point of it, right? The whole point of conservatism is problem solving within a framework of limiting principles. It's an important definition for conservatism. It's a process-oriented political philosophy, which is quite different from a progressive political philosophy, which is really outcome-oriented. They want something, so make a law that makes it. That doesn't take into account fiscal responsibility or second, third order consequences, unintended consequences. Any of those questions are just left unanswered. Conservatives are always asking those questions, and so we desire much more slower, thoughtful decision making. So that's I would say that's the good news. And I don't, again, I have disagreements with my colleagues that some would call fringe, but on policy, it's actually not that clear where we disagree. We disagree in tactics, in tone, we disagree in a lot of those ways. Usually not so much policy. In fact, what you see on the Republican side quite often is this sort of manufactured divisions, because a lot of people on the right think that in order to get more famous and more popular, they have to undercut somebody else on the right. And so they'll try to make up some policy difference that isn't even really there, just to make themselves seem like the more pure conservative. That's the kind of nonsense you see. So, if you're talking about this new wing of the party, it's kind of mostly just about the chest thumping and like the kind of the sort of glittery reality TV show type of conservatism. It's not, but when you really boil it down to policy, and it's also about just hating the left more, right? And this is unfortunately true with a lot of conservatives, if they think the mark of a good conservative is how much you hate the left. And that's unfortunate, and you could easily say the same thing about the left as well, and how they view liberalism and how they define it. Is that ever going to go away? Probably not. It's always been with both parties. This is what we forget. We always look at our current time and we're like, God, this is so bad, so bad. But I don't know that it's any worse. It's kind of always this way. You can read a lot of op-eds and stories and books from decades and decades ago complaining about the exact same things in our politics that we're complaining about now. So a little perspective might be in order. I don't even remember what the original question was.
It was basically what is the current state of the Republican?
Oh yeah. And I think I answered. Look, it's what it should be is a party defined by conservative principles, and that's mostly still true. And like if you look at polling and how people define themselves as a Republican or I'm only a Trump supporter, it's largely becoming just back to sort of republicanism. But people still like Trump. They have good memories of him. He's very popular within the party. Doesn't mean he owns it. We don't. We shouldn't have a party of a person. We have a party of principles, and I think that's where we're going.
And again, just for the last quick question, again, if you all would just mind staying seated, because Congressman has to leave right away for another meeting. And again, just to plug for ourselves, if you want to keep up with what's going on in the world, especially if you're new to us, on January 12th, we're hosting former Afghan Brigadier General Koshal Sadat, who's also the former Deputy Interior Minister for Security for the last few years in, I think about 2 years in Afghanistan, in charge of 130,000 policemen across the country. He did his best to try to weed out corruption. I think he fired something like 24 out of 36 province chiefs. And after a certain point, he he gave up. He felt he couldn't do anymore, and sadly he left the country about 3 months before the Taliban took over. I think it's always interesting to hear perspective.
Probably why he's alive.
Probably why he's alive. Yeah, it's always interesting to hear someone's perspective from the country themselves, and someone actually got his start really where he's noted first. He was the aide-de-camp to General McChrystal early on in his career. So that's an excellent event. And then also related to the military, on January 27th, we're hosting former Lieutenant Colonel Kyle Ann Hunter. She's a former Super Cobra attack helicopter pilot, close-in air support, which I'm sure you guys relied upon sometimes. She's going to talk about the evolving role of women in the U.S. military. Again, just maybe a last kind of fun question. I know people ask it, and feel free to dance around it any way you like. Would you run for higher office in Texas? Or, obviously there's, some national elections coming up in 2024. Is there anything people might want to look out for?
Statewide, sure, but it depends on the climate. It's kind of years from now, and politics is like that. It's not like a career in business where you do want to map out kind of your next steps. Politics, people who map out their next steps very clearly tend to fail at that because they don't seem genuine about it. It seems obvious that they're just looking for the next thing. And so it's important in politics to just set up yourself up for success for whatever opportunities come, but politics is about, your political career is just about what opportunities arise. So that's my way of not answering any questions.
Well, we all